note, left inconspicuously in the corner of the lecture hall balcony, is both history and prophecy. For only we, the reader, know that the anxieties of the note writer did indeed ultimately come true. It reads, quote, "Master Willem was right. Evolution without courage will be the ruin of our race." End quote. This note would imply that humanity itself was evolving, and that the character of those involved would dictate its eventual evolutionary outcome. This is an idea, the idea of humanity's evolution, that we might one day transcend our current biological station, which is steeped in Victorian science and history. In ancient times, people like Aristotle, who certainly noticed and was fascinated by the absolute diversity of animal and plant forms, more or less believed that each species had an ineffable and irreducible quality to it. There were exceptions, of course, the great Anaximander being one of them, but generally speaking, the notion of wide-scale evolution of life was just not held, much less understood as the mechanism by which all of the manifestly rich diversity of forms emerges. But starting in the 18th century and then culminating with Charles Darwin, an appreciation for the mutability of forms, the similarity of related species, the apparent evolutionary arc being displayed in the nascent fossil record, was beginning to take shape. In the decades before Darwin published his history-altering treatise on the origin of species by means of natural selection, it was widely appreciated that there was evolution of life, but there was still much debate as to how evolution occurs. Now we understand it occurs across populations but not individuals, principally through spontaneous genetic variation and the twin culling forces of natural selection and sexual selection. But before Darwin, nobody knew this, and so they were left with a tantalizing mystery. They could tell that humans, like all other species, evolved from something. The question was how, and if this evolution was still ongoing. Many believed evolution could be directed or guided, if only they had the proper insight. Darwin's predecessors, including Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, believed in the transmutation of species, by which species are driven by some unknown force towards further and further complexity up the ladder of being. Darwin himself even believed in a sort of hierarchy of evolution, that is to say, that evolution progresses inexorably towards something, perhaps even towards some ultimate form. Some extrapolated that if man evolved from ape, then the next step in human evolution would be something even greater than man. It is really hard to overstate how significant this perspective shift was on how humanity viewed itself. Like the heliocentric model of the solar system, Darwin's ideas at once displaced man's privileged place in the world, while at the same time they opened up a whole new world of possibility for humanity. While some despaired, fearing we were no better than the apes we apparently descended from, others saw an opportunity. If we could evolve from beasts to men, then could we not continue that progress towards even greater existences? This is the tradition under which Bergenworth and the choir operate, to study biological phenomena to help quote-unquote guide human evolution into a quote-unquote higher form. It doesn't take a great leap to see the similarities between the 19th century, an era of scientific inquiry and enthusiasm during which it was known that species could evolve, but not how they evolved, and the study and methodology of Bergenworth under the direction of Master Willem, who above all else sought to transcend humanity through evolution. Last episode we discussed the story of Mensis as the continuation of a very specific kind of research which began at Bergenworth. If it was Mensis that took the baton of electromagnetism research from Bergenworth, then it was the choir who carried on the tradition of biological inquiry. As their set says, quote, members of the choir are both the highest-ranking clerics of the healing church and scholars who continue the work that began at Byrgenwerth." End quote. Like in our own world, this New Age marked a massive perspective shift. Rather than looking to God for understanding as would have been done by their predecessors, they looked to the study of biology, as they now understood that humans have evolved just like any other creature. So they asked the next logical question: what is next for humanity? Byrgenwerth was already an institution with a rich history by the time of Willem, but that is a story for another day. For our purposes, the study of biology, as it pertains to human evolution, really kicks off with a singular event: the discovery of the corpse of Cos. Because along with this discovery, the discovery of a physical, corporeal Great One was an equally startling one: that Cos was infested with parasites. As the Cos parasite reads, quote, "When the carcass of Cos washed up on the coast, its insides were teeming with tiny parasites, unlike any found in humans." End quote. This represented an opportunity for further research. Byrgenwerth were already engaged in biological research at this time. Just look around their halls for the various biological specimens they were studying and dissecting. But this was something else entirely, because it posed a simple question. If Great Ones had parasites, might humanity become more like the Great Ones by somehow harnessing these parasites? After all, there is a delicate pairing of parasite and host physiology. Most parasites have only a single host, or at least only a single definitive host. And both host and parasite often have specific evolutionary traits that align their physiologies. And so, at Byrgenwerth began the great project of using cosmic parasites to elevate, or evolve, humanity. This project would see many iterations over the years, from the surgical implantation of brain-sucking parasites into hosts, to the cultivation of lumenwoods as hosts of phantasms. But it began in earnest with the study of invertebrate hosts of the cosmic parasites, and its first major breakthrough occurred through the experiments in the Healing Church's research hall. The textual evidence for Byrgenwerth's study of evolution comes mainly from the description of the Metamorphosis rune, which reads, quote, "The discovery of blood made their dream of evolution a reality. Metamorphosis, and the excesses and deviation that followed, were only the beginning." End quote. Here the writers make the common mistake of conflating metamorphosis, which occurs within an individual, like a caterpillar becoming a butterfly, and evolution, which occurs across generations and at the population scale. But this is a common conflation and not worth dwelling on. What is important, however, is that it tells us that Byrgenwerth scholars dreamed of evolution, undoubtedly human evolution, and most importantly, that it was quite explicitly the discovery of blood that made this dream a reality. Since this rune was specifically left by Carroll, not all runes were discovered by Carroll, but this one evidently was, it means that the study of metamorphosis began at Byrgenwerth, before the Healing Church split off. Simply put, Byrgenwerth were studying evolution by using the old blood, not on themselves, but on experimental non-human subjects. This helps to contextualize the forensic evidence within Byrgenwerth, specifically the cages containing dissected, immature forms of the celestial larvae. They needed to understand these creatures in order to understand the host-parasite relationship. Later on, Lawrence's Healing Church took this research a step further by experimenting with parasites on human subjects. Blood allowed them to change their physiology to become better hosts for the phantasms, all for the purpose of expanding their minds, which, in this case, as we will soon see, is meant to be taken quite literally. This is a critical point to understand. It is commonly accepted within Bloodborne's lore community that this split between Willem and Lawrence occurred because of the use of blood, specifically that Willem simply refused to use it at all. But that is only half true. From the Metamorphosis rune, we know that they were using blood to study evolution, and certainly Willem's admonishment to fear the old blood only makes sense if he was already well acquainted with its effects. As the note in the lecture hall says, quote, "Master Willem was right. Evolution without courage will be the ruin of our race," end quote. Willem clearly knew the power of the old blood, meaning he must have seen its effects somehow, and he believed humanity was not ready for its transformative power, not until they had achieved sufficient insight. It seems the line that Willem would not cross is that he would not use blood on human subjects, instead preferring to study evolution in lesser species first, thus the dissected animals and the statues of metamorphosis adorning the school's exterior. Lawrence, however, was perfectly happy to use the blood on people, as we will discover in the research hall. The story of the blood saint Adeline is horrifying and tragic, but it is also ultimately quite informative. So let's start at the beginning. She was, as far as we know, a human Yarnamite like any other, before the experiments on her were begun. According to her blood description, quote, Adeline was originally one of the blood saints who received treatment by the church to cultivate worthy blood. Adeline's was one of the few cases that turned out favorably, end quote. So she received treatment in order to cultivate worthy blood, something which evidently worked, as her blood does indeed have special healing properties. And as the description says, her case did turn out favorably. But she also tells us, later on, that she was, quote, once a blood saint, end quote, when she offers us her blood, indicating that her current situation is quite separate from that role. Based on the forensics of the area in which we find her, it is reasonable to assume she received healing blood transfusions to make her physiology more malleable and allow her to survive the experiments. But the actual experiments, the true focus of the work done to her, was something else entirely. She and the other research hall patients were being infected with brain parasites, specifically brain amoeba, in order to expand their minds. This was a strategy that traces its origin back to the discovery of the cause parasite, and the idea that parasites may be the key to elevating human beings to the next stage of evolution. And quite explicitly, that was the goal of the research hall, as Adeline's parasite-infected mind does indeed discover a revelation, in the form of the milkweed rune, which reads, quote, "Those who swear this oath become a lumen wood that peers towards the sky, feeding phantasms in its luscious bed. Phantasms guide us and lead us to further discoveries," end quote. In other words, the whole objective here is to become a host for phantasms, which will then lead us to greater insight. If you have any doubt that transformation into a host for phantasms was the goal, then just look at the cerebral patients slinking around like invertebrates on the ground floor of the research hall. Not only do they exhibit decidedly non-human locomotion, but this is at least in part because they have been bound, straitjacket style, to prevent the regular use of their limbs. Whoever bound them wanted them to transform into an invertebrate. All of this reminds one of Lamarck's use and disuse theory of evolution, wherein evolution can be directed by promoting or preventing use of a given organ or function. It was Lamarck, by the way, who first coined the term invertebrate. So in the case of the research hall patients, the idea was to transform them into invertebrate hosts for phantasms, thereby elevating their minds. This may sound straightforward enough, at least by the eldritch logic of Bloodborne's world, but the actual process of this transformation was, in fact, extremely gruesome. The The patients of the research hall were infected with parasites by deliberately imbibing infected water, in all likelihood sourced from those wells throughout the fishing hamlet. The brain fluid description reads, quote, grayish amoeba-shaped brain fluid, wobbles and bounces, extracted from a patient whose head expanded until that was all that they were. In the early days of the healing church, the great ones were linked to the ocean, and so the cerebral patients would imbibe water and listen for the howl of the sea. Brain fluid writhed inside the head, the initial makings of internal eyes, end quote. This description tells us several critical points. First, it implies that the parasite is an amoeba, which, unfortunately, is a real-world phenomenon as well. The brain-eating amoeba Naegleria fowleri kills a handful of people every year who are infected by swimming in colonized water. Second, the description tells us that these patients would deliberately imbibe the water, meaning their infection is no accident, but is in fact the intended consequence of the experiment. This infection would then cause changes to their neurophysiology, leading their heads to expand until the point that they heard the howl of the sea. In other words, they had auditory hallucinations.
Oh, that sticky sound, as clear as day. Slip, slop, drip, drop, slip, slop.
And when we say their heads expanded, by the looks of things, we do not mean that purely metaphorically. Their heads literally expanded because they were so full of water. In other words, they suffered from hydrocephalus. Hydrocephalus, literally waterhead in Greek, is one of the earliest attested to maladies in all of medical literature, described by Hippocrates, he of the famous Hippocratic Oath, as well as Galen and many other classical physicians and writers. Hydrocephalus is typically caused by an infection or a structural blockage of the normal pathways of brain fluid production and drainage. And while it can affect anyone at any age, the massive head expansion seen in these patients really only occurs in infants due to their skulls not being fully fused yet. As the fluid builds up, it causes an expansion of the skull, leading to the characteristically enlarged heads. Hydrocephalus is treated today by inserting a catheter into the fluid-filled spaces in the skull, called ventricles, to allow them to drain. The first documented attempted use of this technique, today known as a cerebrospinal fluid shunt, or drain, dates to the mid-18th century in France, using instruments which are suspiciously similar to what we find in the research hall, drilled into the skulls of these unfortunate so-called patients. As it turns out, many brain parasites can actually cause hydrocephalus. Perhaps most well-known among them is the tapeworm Teneosolium, which can cause an obstructive hydrocephalus by cyst formation in the brain, or the protozoan parasite Toxoplasma gondii, which leads to hydrocephalus in infants infected in utero. This, by the way, is the reason expecting mothers are advised to avoid stray cats, as they often harbor this parasite. So, putting that all together, it would appear that these subjects of the research hall imbibed cosmic parasite-infected water, causing hydrocephalus, and were kept alive by the use of healing blood. If they lived long enough, the parasite ravaging their brain and turning it into mush, or writhing inside their heads, as the brain fluid description puts it, would lead them to have hallucinations. And these hallucinations were interpreted by the church as eldritch divination. You need only look around the research hall for a moment to discern that the majority of these patients did not achieve such lofty aspirations. Instead, they simply lost their minds due to the devastating neurologic effects of their parasitic infection. A lucky few, at least, would donate their brain fluid, extracted in the same manner as those crude experiments in 18th century France, in the hopes of augmenting the insight of the other patients. The rest were nothing but living failures. But this was just the first attempt by the Healing Church to use cosmic parasites to elevate humanity's thought. Though it would take time and sacrifice and many human lives, the process would ultimately be perfected by the secret organization within the church known as the choir. The old lumen flower garden, enclosed within the highest, most exclusive echelon of the Healing Church, is a literal paradise. The word paradise comes from the old Persian word meaning an enclosed garden or park, and has a shared etymology, in fact, with the original term Eden, as in the Garden of Eden. And like Eden, the lumen flower garden was meant to be a sanctuary, a place to commune with the divine. In the nightmare version of the garden, we can see the lumen flowers being tended to by the research hall patients, a relationship made all the more intriguing by Adeline's milkweed revelation, which, as we discussed, quite literally turns the player into a lumenwood that, quote, peers towards the sky, feeding phantasms in its luscious bed, end quote. It is here that we find the Black Sky Eye, a powerful arcane tool that is simply an eye that has been, quote, blessed by phantasm, end quote. In other words, a parasitic infection of the eye. You can watch our Shiburi episode to find out more about Miyazaki's fondness for eye parasites. But it is not until we compare the waking and nightmare version of the lumen flower garden that the full story comes into focus. In the waking world version, occupied by the choir, the research hall patients are gone, and instead there are scattered celestial emissaries. This simple fact would seem to imply that somehow the celestial emissaries are the advanced versions of the experiments done to the research hall patients, and this suspicion is confirmed by closer analysis. Both the cerebral patients and the celestial emissaries have enlarged heads. Both have the characteristically elongated fingers. Their cerebral patients drop blue elixirs in the research hall, associating them with the choir. They are both seen attending to or being harvested from the lumen flower garden. And finally, and most importantly, they perform the same cosmic attack, basically a minor version of a call beyond. Taken together, these tidbits of visual information tell us that the celestial emissaries are, in fact, the next step in the experiments that began in the research hall. That they are products of choir experimentation should not be surprising, since we can send several NPCs to Yasevka's clinic, where the imposter Yasevka, a choir member, will turn them into celestial emissaries.
I've received another patient. This time, I'll be trying old blood. I've achieved much, and I owe it all to you. Take this as thanks, custom made, and cheers to the discovery of kinship. Doesn't it make you feel warm inside?
And we can even see a subject midway through this metamorphosis, who, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on your perspective, apparently did not survive the procedure. In the current version of the choir headquarters, the Upper Cathedral Ward, formerly the orphanage, we do not see any choir members left, scattered as they are from their internecine conflict with Mensis. What we find instead is the highest concentration in-game of the brainsuckers, those developmental offshoots of Demon Soul's mind flayers, right down to their immobilizing spell and the devastating grab attack. Of course, when the brainsuckers grab you, they don't just kill you. Instead, a massive proboscis emerges from their skull and physically drains your insight. These are not the actual choir themselves. In fact, we can find one feeding on a choir member, from whom we obtain the choir set. Instead, they appear to be basically insect parasites, the kin equivalent to the blood tick enemies that show up whenever there's excess spilt blood around. And the choir, evidently, have largely turned into blue-eyed beasts, since several of them can drop blue elixirs. But where do these brain suckers come from? Taking a closer look at their skull, we can see evidence of a craniotomy, meaning that the skull has been cut open, and it is this that allows the proboscis to emerge during their grab attack. So their origin seems clear enough. They are the result of attempts, probably from the choir, to transplant insect parasites directly into the human skull, thereby granting insight to the host. Visually, it looks quite similar to the Cos parasite, so it may be that the choir took parasites directly from the corpse of Cos and transplanted them into the brain of their experimental subjects. Indeed, what else do we see in the surgery altar than the literal placing of an eye, that is to say, eyes on the inside, or insight, into the skull of the subject? This is the surgery being referred to in the surgery altar. Review of the Madman's Knowledge and Great One's Wisdom icons drives this point home even further. To have insight is to have phantasms inside your brain. Of course, there are many ways to interpret this understanding, but we know that many characters in-game interpreted it quite literally, that in order to gain insight, they needed to be hosts to phantasms, to be kin of the cosmos. The final phase of the Church's experiments with evolution and parasitology began with the discovery of the East Chalice, which led to the formation of the choir and, more importantly, an audience with a real live Great One, Ebrietas. As they discovered more and more types of phantasms in the Chalice dungeons, and with a Great One to guide them, they ultimately perfected their evolutionary ambitions, successfully turning their subjects into celestial emissaries, their heads sufficiently expanded to allow communion with the divine cosmos, but not so expanded that it would kill the subject. But was that their ultimate goal? Sure, they wanted insight, to peer into the cosmos with their own minds, to elevate their minds, but they also wanted something else. After all, we don't just find the celestial emissaries in the Upper Cathedral Ward, we also find the celestial larvae, along with lots of metamorphosis statues, variations on Bergenworths. And where do these celestial larvae come from? Well, they come from human surrogates, of course. This conclusion comes from the clearest example of a nascent celestial larvae, the one born from Ariana, since we can see her give birth to it during the Red Moon. But the presence of numerous celestial larvae in the Upper Cathedral Ward indicates that her special pregnancy is not nearly the first in the Church's history. Of course, we are aware that this topic is a matter of great speculation for many years now, but we can't help but throw our own tinfoil hat into the ring. The celestial larvae all gaze towards Ebrietas, even those at the bottom of the elevator shaft, suggesting an unrequited parent-child connection. The larvae yearning for their mother, and Ebrietas herself too consumed with grief over the loss of Ram to even notice, her perpetual weeping having already filled the entire arena with tears. "O fair maiden, why is it that you weep?" But of course, even if we can be relatively sure that Ebrietas or any other Great One is their mother, still the question lingers as to how. Copulation in this bizarre eldritch world is not done physically, as Ariana's case demonstrates, and Great One reproduction is, in the end, almost inexplicable, elusive. It certainly eludes systemization in a manner that would have driven Linnaeus himself mad. but there are at least some clear interpretable features, most important of which is the other case of Great One pregnancy, impostor Yosefka. Though a commonly accepted narrative is that Yosefka's cord comes from Bergenworth, this interpretation goes out of its way to ignore the obvious, in our opinion, alternative interpretation. Yosefka is pregnant with an infant Great One. When we find her after the Red Moon, she is on an examination table, in a position quite evocative of labor. Though today the recumbent position is more common historically and even still somewhat today, the positions taken by a woman during labor often emphasized precisely the position Yosefka is in, on the hands and knees. And her dialogue is quite suggestive, to say the least.
God, I'm nauseous. Have you felt this? It's progressing. I can see things. I knew it. I'm different. I'm no beast. Oh, God, it feels awful. But it proves that I'm chosen. Don't you see how they writhe inside my head? It's rather rapturous.
She seems to be telling us that the pregnancy is progressing, that she's almost ready to deliver. Her being chosen as surrogate womb is a source of honor, though it feels quite awful. She's nauseous and in pain, a sentiment undoubtedly shared by many soon-to-be mothers in the real world. The convulsions she is having may even be signs of eclampsia, a dangerous condition affecting women at the end of pregnancy, in which they develop high blood pressure and seizures. When we put her out of her misery and sever the connection between her and her child, just as we do with Ariana, we obtain a third umbilical cord, the clearest evidence that she is indeed pregnant with an infant Great One. But to return to her dialogue, it reveals that she is both pregnant and that something is writhing around inside her head. Unless we put you to sleep earlier during this video, it should be clear what that latter part means. Phantasms, the familiars of the Great Ones, are writhing around inside her mind, the end stage of the experiments with parasitic infection that began all those years ago in the research hall. And here, finally, we can reconcile these two seemingly disparate lines of evidence. On the one hand, members of the church seem to want to elevate their minds, but they also separately want to, or at least consent to, become surrogate wombs for Great Ones. We would propose that these processes are highly interdependent. Perhaps they are even the same thing. In order to birth Great Ones, humans must become either kin and elevate their minds, or otherwise become host to a cosmic parasite. Even Ariana's pregnancy results from Odin writhing around inside her blood, and blood parasites are a major theme of the story we haven't even touched upon. As Yosefka says, quote, "I knew it, I'm no different, I'm no beast," end quote, indicating that her pregnancy confirms she is no beast. Beasts cannot become surrogates for the cosmic Great Ones, but kin can. And from all those blue-eyed beasts in Upper Cathedral Ward, we know the fate of most of her sect. But Yosefka is different because she's a suitable host for the phantasms. In parasitology, this is known as an indirect life cycle, meaning that the parasite has multiple potential host species, but its sexual reproductive phase is only present in one, the definitive host. Much like the xenomorph from Ridley Scott's Alien, the form of the adult parasite need not be at all similar to the infectious, immature form. The humans of the choir are busy transforming themselves such that they may be suitable, definitive hosts for the phantasms, and ultimately, if the process progresses sufficiently, to give birth to an infant Great One. Nature may not always be pretty, but it sure as hell gets the job done, and it only has one goal: to reproduce. Over time, and with enough selective pressure, that inexorable reproduction leads, invariably, to evolution.